What's up, you guys? Welcome back to LeMaster Tech, and in today's video I'm going to give you a basic introduction to data types and variable types in C++, as well as some basic string and numerical functions you can use. Alright, so this video is going to be kind of episode 2 in our C++ tutorial series, a continuation on the previous video where we talked about creating your first program and some basic console out methods and some basic ways of structuring your program. So if you need that, check that out. I will leave a card to it somewhere linked. Otherwise, let's get right into the content for this video. So first thing I'm going to talk about is actually just comment styles, because if you're familiar with other programming languages, you know there's always some way of leaving text in your program that does not actually have any functional code. So like in Python, you can do it with a hashtag or a £, or you can do it with like 3 single apostrophes. But in C-based languages, it's different. In C++ in particular, you can do the double hashtag, or you can do kind of a block of text by doing a forwards. I think I said double hashtag, double / or you can create like a block of text by starting one of these chains, which is / and then a star, and then star, and then /, and then anything in here will be a comment. So that's just a quick introduction to comments. I'm going to try to use more comments. That's something I frequently get as feedback on the channel, is I just get writing code. I don't leave enough comments. So I will try to do that, and I'll mostly use these double / because most of my comments can stay on one line. But it's nice to know about the other style as well. All right, so let's talk about data types and variables. And so we talked a little bit about this previously, because the first program we made had a string example and a number example in it. But let's just really quickly go through the most commonly used types of variables. There are always going to be a few one-off situations where you'll learn about a weird, a unique variable. You can even create like a user-defined data type, but we're going to keep this one basic because you'll be able to write a ton of programs just with what we cover here. So the first is probably the most obvious one, is string. And we talked about this as well. To define a variable as a certain data type, it's different than in Python, where you would like just type in sample string and then equals, and as long as the stuff you put over here is like a string, it knows it's a string. You actually have to tell it what data type it's going to be. So you need to have the word string and then the variable name, and then if you want, you can set it equal to an initial value right on this line, or you can just leave it at that, and then later in your program you can come through and give it actual text. So let's say we want to make this sample string equals LeMaster Tech. These two lines of code could definitely be combined. You just put the equals after sample string. I'm going to do the rest of the examples on one line. I just wanted to show that this is legit too. You don't have to have an initial value for it just to name and define your sample. So the second one I want to talk about is definitely less common than a string. It's basically just a single character. So I'm going to make sample char as my variable name. And when I say single character, that means you use these single quotations instead of the doubles that are used for strings. And in here, it can only take up to 1 character. So it can be a number or a letter, because it's sort of like one snippet of a string. So you can put 1 character in here, but if you try to put a second character in as a char variable, it's going to fail. So it's only going to take the first character you put in anyways. So it's good to know about those, but you're not going to use them that often, especially because there's no reason not to make a string that just has 1 character in it. So there might be a situation where you want a grade book or something that can only ever have 1 letter, but even in those sorts of applications, you're probably going to end up using a string more often than not. But it's useful to know about this if you come across single character variables in your programming adventures. It's good to know where that's coming from and what it does. Now let's talk about some of the numerical types of variable you can have. So let's start with int. And this is going to be just an integer value. So it can be positive or negative. You know, it can be negative any whole number, or it can be positive any whole number. It just needs to be a whole number. And then the next I want to talk about is one of the two types of decimal values that you might use sometimes. In general, you're actually not going to use a float because the next one we talk about is a little bit more robust and a little bit more accurate. But a float is a valid form of decimal number. It's just basically like a floating decimal point numerical value. But the one you'll find more often, and you'll probably want to just lean towards as your default variable, is a double. And the reason for that is it has more decimal places, and it is a more precise number and a more precise form of doing math in general. But so these are all of your kind of basic primary variable types. And there's one thing missing that's maybe not intuitive. You might not think of it as a variable type, but if you're familiar with programming at all, you know computers basically boil down to ones and zeros. They essentially boil down to making very simple binary decisions as a true or a false or a 0 or a 1. There is a data type for that called a Boolean. Boolean is just a special word that basically is computer lingo for true, false, 1 byte binary. And so to create a Boolean, it's bool, B-O-O-L, and then variable name, just like any other variable. And then you give it either true or false. Those are the only two states it can have. And so this can be really useful in making like binary logic decisions. Like if this thing is true, do this. Otherwise, do this other thing. There's no reason it has to be binary. You don't always need a Boolean. You can pretty much always find another way to write the program if you want, but it's very useful to know about this. So these basic variable types, and this is true across most programming languages, these variable types are going to enable you to write almost any program by combining them with lists and functions and operations, manipulating them in your advanced programs that you'll create. These are going to always be kind of the primary data types and variable types that you'll be using. All right, so the two that probably come up the most and have the most that you can do with are strings and numbers. So let's go ahead and take a look at some ways that you can do string operations. And that'll be the next section we talk about here. So let's say that we want to get a specific piece of a string. So we have our sample string up here from before, LaMasterTech. Let's say we want to get one character out of it. We just want to know what it starts with. Well, let's say character sample indexer. So in general, what spot in a string a single character has is referred to as its index. You'll hear it called some other things, but index is by far the most common one. And in programming lingo, you always start counting from 0. So like to look at LaMasterTech here, the capital L is actually what character you have in index 0. Lowercase e is in 1. The M is in 2. A, S, T, E, R. So you count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 8 is just a space. And then 9 is the capital T. And to show you this, I will say that the sample indexer is equal to, and the way you address a single character of a string is with these square brackets. So let's say we want the capital T at tech. As long as I counted correctly, just putting a 9 in these square brackets should give you just a capital T. And so we can check that by using what we covered before, how we're going to display a line of text onto the console is cout and then less than sign. And then the thing we want to be shown on screen, and in this case we'll say the sample indexer, and then less than, and then end L with a semicolon. And so now if I run this, it should just give us character 9 from the sample string in our console window here. So let's go ahead and run it. And there you can see we get the capital T right there. So that's how you address a specific character in a string. And the second way to check what actual like substring you want. So let's say next we have a new string variable that I will call my sample substring. This is checking for a whole row of information, a whole series of characters from a string to make a substring of. So let's say we wanted to go back to our Lemaster text sample string. So we have sample underscore string, just like that. And instead of the square brackets now, we're going to use this function that's dot substr, and that stands for substring. And you give this 2 arguments. You give it the starting character, and then you give it the number of characters you want to count. So let's say we want to start at 9, which is the capital T, right? And we want it to be 4 characters. This should give us the word tech as a substring of the main string that's above us. So let's go ahead and run that just so we can see and make sure I didn't make any mistakes. There you go, tech. And now you may say, well, what if I don't always know the end of the string? It's actually not going to throw an error, even if you make this longer than the string is. So like obviously the most we have is tech and then the string is over. But if I say I want it to be 8 characters long, it's still just going to give us tech. That's fine. And if I say I only want this to be 2 characters long, it'll just give us the TE that we asked for. So that's how you pull a substring out of a primary string. This is how you address a specific character. You can, just like any variable, you can overwrite a specific character. So you could say here, sample string 9 equals, and you could say, let's make it a capital L instead of a capital T. That was probably stupid. But now if you see what happens to the thing we print out, instead of TE, it's LE, because you can change a specific character in your string by using this same format as you can just to look up what it is. So there's a couple basic string operations, and let's do one more that I think is pretty useful. We're going to find if a substring is in a main string of text, and if it is, we're going to print out where it starts. So to do this, we're going to want a integer value, because it's actually going to, if it's true, it's going to return the number at which the sample string starts. So we're going to make a new variable that I will call find substring. And we're going to set it equal to a sample string dot, and this is another function that we're going to use that comes kind of built in with C++ strings, dot find, and then we give this 2 arguments. We give it the substring it's looking for, so let's say tech, and then we give it, if we want, this is actually an optional argument, but you give it what index to look after. So let's say at first we just want to start at 0. Now let's print find substring and see what this gives us. Now we know, because we have used, I forgot a semicolon, we know because we already looked it up so that we could use the 9 before, that it starts at 9. So this is good to know, but let's say that instead of tech, because we've been using that one, we actually want to do ER space tech. Okay, so we know that this substring should exist here, which, counting back a little bit, that would be 9876. So if we run this now, it should give us the index at which, the index at which our substring starts. And then what's neat is if we make this 8 or something that's after that substring appears, and we run it, we'll get -1, which is essentially the find substring, the find function's way of saying I didn't find it. Because obviously this is an integer, not a Boolean. So most of the time when it finds the substring, it's going to tell you where it was. But when it doesn't, it's going to return a -1, meaning I didn't find it. Okay, so that's the find substring function, and that is pretty useful. And for now, I'm going to leave it with that, because there's obviously a ton of ways you can manipulate strings. But this is an introduction video, so if you have any specific questions, feel free to ask them in the comments, or we'll probably cover them in a future video as our programs get more complex. But for now, let's cover some basic math operations. Okay? And so for math, we talked a little bit about the difference between an integer, a double, and a float. But let's just start looking at what you can actually do with those. So I'll make a new cout line just to talk a little bit about some of the ways that math works in C++. So if I do 5 plus 7, you can do basic math just like that, just typing the operations. And if I run this, you'll see we should get 12. There we go. We got 12 right there. And this works for 4 operators. So it works for plus, it works for minus, it works for division, which is a /, and it works for multiplication, which is the star key. So I'm just keep track of what we talk about here: plus, minus, division, star key. These 4 are your basic operations, but some additional stuff you can do right here. This is a character that most programming languages have. It's even often represented as the percentage key. This is called the modulo operator. And this is essentially saying remainder. So if I were to say 11, and this would be read as mod 5, and I were to run it, you're going to see we get a 1. Because 11 divided by 5 is obviously 2, but it's 2 and then 1/5, right? So is 11 divided by 5 is checking how many whole times the divisor fits into the number, and then what's left over. So if I had like 22 mod 5, we should get a 2 because 5 fits into 24 times, and then there's 2 left over. So it's essentially, there you go, there's 2. So it's essentially a remainder function. It won't come up as often as the basic math operations, but you will find yourself using it possibly more times than you would expect. All right, now a second thing about how numbers work: if I were to try to combine an integer with a decimal in math, what you'll see when I run it is it's going to automatically update it to a double or a decimal or a float. You know, it's going to have the decimal points because it knows, all right, 22 plus 5, I have one more accurate, more precise number. I have a double, and I have one integer. By default, it's going to increase the, I guess, smartness, if you will, of the math and say, well, an integer plus a double, my answer should be a double, so I make sure not to chop off the decimal place. So it's smart enough to know to do that for you. But if you were to do 10 divided by 6, which obviously does not evenly divide, so we should get essentially 1 2/3, right? 1.66666. Well, if I run this, it's just going to give me 1 because it's not smart enough to know, oh, well, I was given 2 integers and an operation, but I should convert to double because they're going to want a smarter operation. It doesn't know that by default. But if you make either of these numbers just a 0.0, so you still kind of have an integer because it's a whole number, but you've added a decimal place to it. Well, if I run it now, I get 1.667. So there you go. It gets more precise. So it's just important to know, even if you have integers, it's not a bad idea to make one of them a double or make all your numbers doubles, even if you're using them like integers. Okay, so that's a little basic on how that works. And then probably the next thing I want to talk about is the incrementer tool. So let's make an integer and let's just say it's a counter, okay? And initially it equals 0. Well, there's a built-in function to add 1 to a number, and it's ++. So I'm going to go ahead and show you. If I just say counter ++ and then print out what the counter is, even though I said it was 0 initially, it's going to give us a 1 because that ++ automatically adds 1 to a value. This is really useful for like for loops or while loops or anything where you want like an indexer to loop through something. This also works with minus. It just will subtract 1, and this can go negative, so that will give you a -1. You can see there. And then with that, so now we've talked about those. We've talked about ++, minus. And with that, there is also the ability to do minus equals. And then instead of always subtracting 1, you can tell it how much to subtract. So you can say, actually, I want to subtract 3 from what I already was. So that's saying 0 minus 3. And then obviously the counter to that is plus equals. You can affect how much you want to add to it. So that's plus equals and minus equals. Those are some pretty basic useful tools as well while you're looping through numbers. And then I want to talk about importing tools. So we kind of included the IO stream for the first project and for this one so that we could print stuff out onto the console, but we didn't really talk about what this is. This is essentially an import statement. It's saying I want a package of functionality that's not by default available in my program, but C++ is able to use it. And to do that, we just use the # and then include, and then the name of our module. Okay, and so for this one, the name of the module is going to be C Math because it uses a lot of built-in native to C programming languages math functions. And some of the things you can do with C Math are really cool and really useful. And so to do this, let's just make a double real quick that I will call my decimal. All right, so it's a decimal number that I'm just going to print out onto the screen so I can show you what's happening with all the functions we're about to use. Let's start by talking about raising something to a power. All right, so to do this, it's just pow. And then you give it 2 arguments. You give it the number, and then you give it the power you're raising it to. So this would be 3, 9, 27, should be 81 when we show this on the screen. There you go, we get 81. So the pow function is just looking for the number, and then the power you want to raise it to. The next function we'll talk about is going to be using the square root. So it's sqrt. And then you just give it the number you're looking for the square root of. And so let's do one that we know will work first. Obviously, the square root of 16 is 4. But let's give it a number that we know won't be a whole number. So let's say, what's the square root of 13.5? It's 3.67423, which is neat. I didn't know that. But so these things will get real accurate. They don't have to be whole numbers. They don't have to be integers. And now let's talk a little bit about the round functionality. So I'll leave 13.5 in there. Round is going to follow default rounding commands, which are essentially anything below 0.5 you round down, anything above 0.5 you round up. There are 2 ways to change this, and one is ceil. So ceil is always going to round up, which ceil stands for ceiling, C-E-I-L. It's going to round your value to the ceiling. So 13.2, even though it's obviously closer to 13 by standard rounding rules, it's going to round up because we're using ceiling. Now the opposite of this is floor rounding, which is going to take a number like 13.7, which obviously should round up. It's closer to 14. And we're going to round down to 13. So now we have pow, we have square root, we have round, we have ceil, and we have floor. And actually, this would probably be a good time to change this comment to the, let's do it this way. Let's change it to the multi-line comment, because that is going to be something we want to break onto multiple lines. It's getting hard to read. There we go. So there we go. We covered something in the beginning I didn't think we'd need, and we needed it. Look at that. All right, and now there's a few other things we'll touch on really quickly. One is going to be the fmax function. So this is where you give it 2 arguments, and you want to return what the larger of it is. So let's say we were given 13.7 and 4.5. It'll tell us the larger is 13.7. The complement to this is fmin. It's going to tell us what the smaller number is. And you may say, this is stupid. I'm going to type in 2 numbers and it's going to tell me the larger or the smaller. Well, it's not actually stupid, because a lot of the times these would be variables. Like this would be the result of the score of the game you just played. And then the second one would be the high score you already had. And they're stored in variables. And what you'll want to do is you'll want to move whichever one of those 2 is larger into the new high score variable. So there are reasons that you need to know these, even though seeing them typed in directly like that might not make a ton of sense right now. So that's the max and min functionality. And I think those are all the ones I'm actually going to give a example for, because this is kind of a long video and I know you guys want to get writing programs. So one thing I will say is all the trigonometric stuff in here is also available. So that's sine, cosine, tangent, You can use logarithmic functions, so log is in there, log base 10 is in there. Exponentials, where it's not just raising it to a power, it's actually the e to the whatever. Those are all available within the math function as well. So be sure to go in, play around. We're going to be using some of this stuff in the future. Some of the first projects we're going to build are like calculator type functions. So it's really useful to know about the math functionality. But that is a basic introduction to strings, a basic introduction to numbers. We covered data types and variable types, so there's a ton of information in here. I hope you're enjoying the C++ series. Be sure to let me know in the comments what you'd like to see more of, what kind of stuff you want us to eventually get to, whether that's games and game-specific programming or more data science applications. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate the support. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like on the video, and as always, good luck with your code, and thanks for watching. Thanks, bye.